A strong China is predictable. It grows, it builds, it competes. A collapsing China is something else entirely. Because when a country this large starts to struggle, it doesn't just slow down. It looks for ways to regain control, to restore strength, to change the narrative. And that is where things get dangerous. Because systems under pressure don't act rationally. They take risks they normally wouldn't. They make moves the world isn't ready for. And right now, China is entering that phase. The most unstable moments in history don't come from rising powers. They come from powers that feel like they're losing their grip. For the better part of 3 decades, the world structured itself around a single assumption. China was going to keep rising. Not gradually, not cautiously, permanently, powerfully, and without meaningful interruption. And honestly, there was plenty of reason to believe it. After the reforms of the late 20th century, China became the manufacturing engine of the modern world. Hundreds of millions of people were lifted out of poverty in a generation. Skylines that didn't exist in 1990 became some of the largest cities on Earth by 2010. Supply chains, trade routes, shipping networks, all of it rebuilt around the expectation that Chinese growth was the new gravity of the global economy. The world didn't just adapt to China's rise, it bet on it, heavily, and for decades. Banks invested in it, governments built trade policy around it, corporations relocated entire production lines to take advantage of it. By the 2010s, China was contributing nearly a third of all global economic growth. Entire national development strategies in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America were designed around Chinese demand for resources, Chinese investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, and Chinese appetite for commodities. The IMF, the World Bank, every major forecasting institution on Earth, all of them had some version of the same long-term outlook. The Chinese economy continues to expand, and the world continues to adapt around it. That is how deeply the assumption ran. But here's what nobody tells you about how a bet that big, when the underlying assumption shifts, everything built on top of it shifts too. And the assumption is shifting. Today in 2026, China is not the unstoppable machine the world planned for. Growth is still happening, officially. Beijing hit its 5% target in 2025, but underneath that headline number, something more troubling is taking shape. Quarterly growth decelerated through the year, finishing at just 4.5% in the final quarter, the weakest since early 2023. And the growth target Beijing set for 2026, it's the lowest target announced since the early 1990s. Meanwhile, independent analysts at the Rhodium Group estimate actual growth may be running below 3% when you strip out methodology. China is slowing, not collapsing, but slowing, and slowing in ways that matter enormously. The property sector, once the engine inside the engine, is still in deep crisis. Since China's housing market peaked in 2021, prices have fallen 20 to 40%. Not 5, not 10%, but between 20 and 40%. 77 property developers have defaulted on their debts since 2020. Evergrande, one of the world's most valuable real estate brands, was ordered into liquidation in January of 2024 and officially delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange in August of 2025. Country Garden, another giant, is still struggling to survive. Thousands of apartment buildings sit half-finished across the country, bought and paid for by ordinary Chinese families who are still waiting for homes that may never be completed. Now, this matters far beyond the real estate industry. In China, property wasn't just a place to live. It was the primary store of household wealth, the backbone of local government revenue, and one of the largest contributors to economic output. At its peak, the sector and everything connected to it accounted for roughly a quarter of the entire economy. When it broke, it didn't just hurt homeowners. It hollowed out municipal budgets, froze construction, and punched a hole in consumer confidence that Beijing is still struggling to repair. Local governments in 12 high-debt provinces, including Tianjin, Guizhou, and Yunnan, have been flagged by authorities as carrying elevated fiscal risk, their finances increasingly dependent on central government transfers rather than the land revenues that they used to count on. And then there's deflation. While the rest of the world spent the last 3 years fighting rising prices, China has been experiencing the opposite. The GDP deflator, a broad measure of price changes across the entire economy, has been negative for 3 consecutive years. consumer prices averaged zero inflation throughout 2025. Now, on the surface, falling prices sound like a good thing, but in reality, deflation is a trap. Businesses delay investment because things will be cheaper tomorrow. Consumers hold back spending for the exact same reason. Debt becomes heavier in real terms. The World Bank flagged this explicitly in December of 2025, calling it a balance sheet recession, a warning that deflationary pressures are expected to persist. The economy is going to start eating itself from the inside. But the economy is only one crack. The population problem is something else entirely. China's demographic collapse is not a future threat. It's happening now, in real time, faster than almost any demographer predicted. In 2025, China's population fell for the fourth consecutive year. The country recorded just 7.92 million births, the lowest number since the People's Republic was founded in 1949. For context, in 2016, China recorded nearly 18 million births. So in less than a decade, that number has been cut in half. The birth rate has now fallen to 5.63 births per 1,000 people. And marriages, the leading indicator for future births, have plunged by a fifth in 2024, the biggest single-year drop on record. At the other end of the age curve, 323 million Chinese citizens are now aged 60 or older, making up 23% of the total population. The United Nations projects China could lose more than half its population by the end of the century. That's not a rounding error. That is the effective hollowing out of an entire civilization's demographic foundation. And the working age population is already shrinking, with the 16 to 59 cohort falling to just 60.6% of the total in 2025. There's a structural concept in Chinese demography known as the 4-2-1 family structure: 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child, with that single child expected to carry the financial and caregiving weight of the entire extended family. That model, which the one-child policy baked into an entire generation, creates enormous dependency pressure precisely when the state most needs social stability. It concentrates risk into the smallest possible household unit at exactly the moment the pension system is under strain and healthcare costs are rising. And the generation caught in the middle, young Chinese who were supposed to power the next phase of growth, are disengaging. Youth unemployment for those aged 16 to 24 hit 18.9% as of mid-2025. And that's just the official figure. The data methodology was overhauled after the numbers first reached above 20% in 2023, because they were becoming a political problem. In parallel, a cultural movement called lying flat, tangping in Mandarin, has spread across Chinese social media, a deliberate, quiet refusal to participate in the competitive grind of a system that no longer seems to deliver what it once promised. The state has tried everything to reverse this: cash incentives for births, propaganda campaigns about family values, subsidies amounting to what Reuters estimates could reach 180 billion yuan in 2026. None of it has meaningfully moved the needle, because the underlying logic driving young Chinese to disengage is economic, not cultural. The numbers don't add up, and they know it. China's pension system is already feeling the weight of all this. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has warned that the National Pension Fund faces serious long-term stress. More than 300 million people aged 60 and over are now drawing on a system that was designed around a very different age structure. The working age population is shrinking. The retired population is growing. And the middle, the cohort that was supposed to bridge the gap, is the generation choosing to not have children. That is not a cycle that fixes itself quickly. In fact, according to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, China's birth collapse since 2016 is nearly unheard of outside of active wartime. What we are watching is a peacetime demographic contraction moving at wartime speed. Individually, these are serious problems. Together, they create something that has no quick fix: a shrinking workforce, a surging elderly population, pension funds running dry, local governments without revenue, and a leadership in Beijing that must maintain the appearance of total control while watching the pillars of its legitimacy quietly erode. And when a system this large starts feeling trapped, something changes at the top. This is where most coverage misses the real story. Xi Jinping's system is not designed for retreat. It is designed for forward motion, for delivering growth, demonstrating strength, maintaining the political legitimacy that comes from an economy that always moves upward. When growth was strong, the party could absorb criticism, tolerate risk, project calm. But a leadership under economic pressure operates with a very different set of constraints. And the choices Beijing is making reveal exactly what kind of pressure it's under. In recent years, the state has moved aggressively to tighten its grip on private enterprise. Alibaba was hit with a $2.8 billion antitrust fine in 2021. Ant Group's IPO, which would have been the largest in history, was killed days before launch in 2020. The entire for-profit tutoring industry, worth hundreds of billions of dollars, was effectively banned overnight in 2021. A mechanism called golden shares, small equity stakes granting special oversight rights, has quietly been inserted into major private companies in media, technology, and data. The message to entrepreneurs and foreign investors is consistent. You operate on the party's terms, or you face the consequences. The result is a chilling effect on exactly the kind of risk-taking that drives long-term innovation. You cannot mandate the informal culture that produces world-changing platforms and technologies. And as the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment remains effectively frozen, killed by political confrontation, Beijing finds itself increasingly diplomatically isolated at precisely the moment it needs economic partners most. The wolf warrior style of Chinese diplomacy that became dominant under Xi has now shown in peer-reviewed research to harden negative perceptions abroad rather than improve them. China is cornering itself. And as economic legitimacy fades, the party leans harder on the one tool that doesn't require GDP growth to function: nationalism, historical grievance, external threats, the idea that China is encircled by hostile forces, and that strength, not compromise, is the only answer. When nationalism becomes the substitute currency of power, internal problems have a tendency to stop staying internal. Hey, if this breakdown is useful, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what comes next is where the internal pressure starts turning into something the entire world has to prepare for. Here's the piece that political scientists have been warning about for years and that mainstream coverage constantly underplays. There is a well-established body of research on what happens to major powers when they peak. Not when they collapse, but when they peak. When growth slows, strategic windows narrow, and leadership looks ahead and sees less room to maneuver than before. Researchers Michael Beckley and Hal Brands, writing in International Security, describe these peaking powers, and they argue that historically, such states have been among the most dangerous actors in the international system. Not because they are weak, because they are still strong enough to cause enormous damage, but increasingly uncertain whether that strength will last. That uncertainty changes the calculus on risk dramatically. The logic runs like this: a rising power that believes time is on its side can afford patience. It waits, it accumulates, it positions. A peaking power sees the opposite, a closing window. And leaders who feel a window closing have historically been willing to take risks that calmer, more confident governments would reject. Apply that logic to China today, and one flashpoint dominates everything else: Taiwan. China's military activity around Taiwan has exploded. According to a new report from Taiwan's Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP, Department of China Affairs, there were 5,709 sorties by the People's Liberation Army in 2025, up from just 380 in 2020. That is a 50-fold increase in a single half-decade. China has conducted large-scale naval drills explicitly simulating blockade operations, surrounding the island with warships in exercises that make little effort to disguise their intent. Military officials have begun publicly discussing blockade scenarios as the policy option. The PLA has deployed carrier task groups to waters near Okinawa, signaling clearly to Japan the cost of intervening in any Taiwan scenario. And in 2025, academic research published in Telecommunications Policy concluded that Taiwan's semiconductor supply chain would be particularly vulnerable to a Chinese quarantine before 2027, meaning the danger window is not theoretical, it's now. This is not background noise. This is a deliberate, sustained, escalating campaign being run by a leadership that cannot afford for it to look like anything other than strength. And the reason Taiwan sits at the center of China's strategic calculus is not just about politics, it's about technology. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced chips. Every AI system, military platform, smartphone, data center, and modern vehicle depends on output from those facilities. Every major technology company on Earth, Apple, Nvidia, Qualcomm, they all depend on TSMC. And TSMC's core operations sit on an island 100 miles off China's coast that Beijing considers an unfinished historical question. Bloomberg Economics estimates that a blockade of Taiwan alone, not even a full invasion, would cost the global economy $5 trillion in the first year. That is larger than the entire GDP of Japan. It would simultaneously shut down chip production for cars, aircraft, weapon systems, and consumer electronics in every major economy. Not for months, but for years, because there was no spare capacity anywhere else in the world capable of absorbing that volume. And here is the part that makes China's strategic clock feel very real. TSMC is currently building overseas fabrication plants in Arizona, Japan, and Germany. So within a few years, those facilities will meaningfully reduce the world's exclusive dependence on Taiwan. The window of maximum strategic leverage is open now. Research published in the Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs in 2025 noted this directly, that TSMC's value in Taiwan is at its peak, and that the longer Beijing waits, the less exclusive that leverage becomes. A leadership that needs an external demonstration of strength, a nationalist narrative that demands historical resolution, a strategic asset whose leverage diminishes each passing year. We have seen this combination before. Germany in 1914 did not go to war because it was confident of victory. German military planners watched Russia's industrial strength expanding and concluded that delay could mean certain disadvantage. They saw a closing window and chose to act before it was shut. The result was catastrophic for everyone, including Germany. Japan in 1941 did not attack Pearl Harbor from a position of strength. Japan attacked because its leaders calculated that U.S. oil restrictions meant slow economic strangulation on a longer timeline. A desperate gamble over a certain slow loss. Again, catastrophe, including for Japan. Neither country expected to win a long war. Both acted because they believed waiting was worse than moving. The pressure of perceived decline collapsed the space for rational caution. That is the historical pattern, and the conditions that have produced it are present in China, today, simultaneously. This is not a prediction of war, it's an honest look at what the conditions are, and those conditions are certainly not stable. Now here is the uncomfortable truth that almost no one in mainstream policy circles want to say clearly. A stable, cooperative China is one of the most valuable things in the global economy. A hostile, cornered China is dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully calculate. But a genuinely chaotic China, a China experiencing real internal breakdown, will become the worst outcome of all. Supply chains that the world has spent 5 years trying to de-risk from, but hasn't. Financial markets still deeply exposed to Chinese debt and demand. A nuclear-armed state in internal crisis. Regional neighbors with no clear framework to respond. The shocks would propagate through the global system in ways nothing in modern economic history has produced. The paradox of where we are today is almost too uncomfortable to sit with. External pressure of China, through tariffs, export controls, diplomatic isolation, constrains its options. But the more constrained these options become, the more pressure builds on a leadership that cannot admit weakness, cannot reverse course publicly, and cannot afford to be seen as losing. That pressure has to go somewhere, and the only question is where. There is no clean answer. The world cannot simply encourage China to open up. Beijing's political system is moving in the opposite direction. It cannot simply isolate China. The entanglement runs too deep, in supply chains, financial markets, and sovereign debt across the developing world. And it cannot simply wait and hope the internal pressures resolve peacefully, because patience is exactly the quality that peaking power dynamics tend to erode first, on both sides. The world spent decades building trade relationships, financial institutions, and security frameworks designed for a rising China. Almost none of that architecture was built for what we are actually watching. A great power that still possesses enormous capacity, that is growing more nationalist rather than more open, and that increasingly feels the clock ticking down on a future it once believed was guaranteed. That is not a stable condition. And if history has anything useful to say on this, it's this. When a great power starts to feel like it's running out of time, the world rarely gets to choose whether it's ready. So here's what we want to know. If the world largely got China's rise right, and it still found it deeply disruptive, what happens when it gets China's decline mostly wrong? And what does a world that hasn't planned for this actually do when the pressure finally finds a release? Let us know in the comments. We genuinely want to hear your take. And if you want to stay ahead of stories that actually matter, the ones under the headlines, subscribe to Fall of Nations. We'll see you in the next one.